Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New Media Show. My name is Todd Cochran, and we've got a great show lined up for you today. But before we introduce our guests, I want to say good morning. Rob, how are you this morning?
Doing terrific, Todd. I just had a cold the last 4 or 5 days, and I'm coming out of it. So my voice is a lot better, and I'm ready to have a great show today and talk about digital audio and what that means in the radio and the podcasting space. And Mark is which you'll be mentioning here in a second, is a great guy to talk about that topic. So, and he's got a fantastic conference too that he's going to tell us about too.
Well, I'm excited to kind of hear this side of the space. So, Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
You know, I do have to ask Rob. Rob, you know, you've been jet setting here quite a bit. So, I get on an airplane tomorrow and head to D.C. So, did you enjoy the cold weather while you're back east?
Well, I mean, I didn't actually go back to New York. So
okay.
I got my planes never got off the ground here in Seattle because they all got canceled. But I have been flying down to Los Angeles every week, and it's been like 80 degrees down there. There's a massive drought going on down there, so it's been really, really sunny and nice down there. And then I come back up to Seattle, and it's rainy and snowy and cold up here. So it's been like this half summer, half winter kind of life for the last 3 weeks.
You know, my wife and I keep talking about maybe someday going back to the mainland, and we had talked about one time maybe going to the Seattle area, but I told her, I said, it's pretty hard to transplant a pineapple to cold and wet. So.
That's true. I mean, it is a big jolt, right?
Yeah.
It's a big difference to go back and forth like that. But yeah.
Yeah, it is. I digress. Hey, but anyway, just to update everyone, we know last week we had Gary Leland on the Pottertainment magazine launch, and it still hasn't launched. The iOS app has not yet been approved, so it's late. Getting out, so I guess there's going to be two issues very close together once this comes online, and then also an update on the Podcast Movement event in Austin. They're up to about 18 grand on their Kickstarter, so it looks like that event's going to be a go because they reached all their goals. So don't forget, if you're thinking about joining folks in August, I guess, please consider going over to Podcast Movement and podcastmovement.com and getting your ticket so that you can be signed up to go to that event. And just north of Dallas is where that's going to be. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into talking with our guest this morning. Mark, I guess I know Rob and you go way back, but for the benefit of the audience, can you give them just a little quick bio on you, a little background?
Sure. I have a company called Mark Ramsey Media. My work is in a couple of areas. I work with broadcasters, and I work people in the audio space and around broadcasters, people like Pandora, people like Apple, and some of the people that enable that space. My work is either strategic, i.e., how do we get competitive advantage over time, or research. For example, how do we build ratings for a radio station? And as well, I do the conference, which we could talk about later, HiVio, and the blog and the speaking and the other stuff. So that's my history. I've been in the audio space and specifically in the radio space for more years than I'd prefer to say, because it makes me look younger when I don't say it.
I could fully appreciate that, Mark. Yes.
and Rob, you and Mark go back to, when you were actually doing a radio show too, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had him on as a guest a long time ago on, I believe it's my IT Conversations network program that I did. Yes.
That's right.
Back in 2005. So it was a long time ago. And we started talking about, on-demand radio and podcasting way back then. And it's just continued. And he's continued, talking about it as well.
But is it really on-demand radio, or is it just streaming radio? Because really, most of the stuff that's on today is live streamed, right?
Well, what are you referring to? You mean that are you talking? I mean, this is where the definitions get so nasty, right?
Yeah.
Here's what I asked when I was at the conference on digital audio in New York a few weeks ago. I was leading a panel, and the question I asked was, because the podcasting people said, "Oh, podcasting is not radio; it's better than radio," and the radio people said, "Oh, it's so much broader," and then the online radio said, "But it's targetable, it's personalizable," and I said, "Look, if you can consume it, if you can measure it, if you can buy it, and if you can hear it, isn't that all radio?" So I don't put any of these distinctions on. Digital is just a means of distribution, whether it's digital, analog, in the box in the car, or in the box in your pocket. It still is audio entertainment and information. In fact, I would prefer to call it audio entertainment and information, quite frankly, regardless of how it's distributed, whether it's IP or something else. But at the end of the day, if you can hear it, if you can measure it, if you can buy it as an advertiser, then that's radio.
Well,
Mark, one thing about that, the term radio does come with some baggage to it. It's a legacy term that basically describes a broadcast tower to a car or a portable radio receiver. Is there a danger, do you think, in us maintaining that name as a reference for a new distribution paradigm? Or are we just using that term in combination with digital just to help people transition?
Well, that's a great question, and I view it from two different perspectives. The inside the beltway perspective, the business of radio perspective, and then the consumer perspective. I think from the consumer perspective, you are right, there is baggage, because radio to them doesn't define a tower. Radio to them defines a box. Yep. It's a box. It's a dial. And by the way, I never buy it. It just comes with other stuff that I buy. I buy a car, the radio comes for free. So to them, I think there is a legacy issue. But this terminology, this debate, this discussion isn't about the consumer side. It's about the industry side. It's about how we see the world. And I think to us, putting radio in a category apart from some of these other things creates boundaries. Boundaries that advertisers run into, boundaries that broadcasters that are trying to see their own future run into, boundaries that podcasters run into. I mean, I was at the first, Rob, you were probably at this. I was at the first, what is now the NMX conference.
Right.
And was then called, Podcasting and New Media, I think?
It was correct. New Media Expo or something like that.
The very first one in Riverside, I think it was. At the convention center there, and I was like the only radio guy there, and I was on a panel, and there were all these podcasters in the room, and it was all this, podcasting against radio thing, and I mean, that's just a losing proposition. At the end of the day, it's one big tapestry of sound distributed across platforms, and I think it's the radio people and the people in the audio space, the business people in the audio space, including advertisers, who need to get around these different definitions, not consumers.
I think in the early days, there was this thing that, okay, we're going to kill radio. Well, realistically, you're not going to kill radio. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's not going to happen. But what I did always say was that what happened really in this evolution in 2004 is, people were creating content on the internet, a lot of content before that, so it wasn't like it was something new, but what really happened was the playing field was leveled with the distribution strategies that were being employed by podcasting, and to be able to take it and listen to it almost as, well, not necessarily in early days as easy as radio, obviously, but, at least you could take what you wanted with you and have it in the car, and that was the big thing. Now we just kind of take it for granted, so I agree with you. It's all about, now really it's about the content. It's not, the technology is really kind of, it's there, but, it's folks don't care. They just want to listen or watch.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the tech is there now, and the usability in a general sense to get access to this digital audio content now, that it is starting to transition to a content game now. And I think that's kind of, if you want to back it up to a 30,000-foot view and look at it, that's where the battle is now. I think it's around building the overall listening audience for on demand or just audio in general, and radio has a piece to play in that. But Mark, I 100% agree that there are definite boundaries right now that have existed around digital and radio for years at the advertiser level too, and those borders need to come down. And I mean, everybody needs to think about this as a more complete medium. And I think that the radio folks have a huge opportunity in front of them, but they are going to have to change what they do.
Absolutely. And the it's funny because advertisers in particular, their dilemma is particularly peculiar because on the one hand they're all consumers, just like we are. On the other hand, they're advertisers, and they go to work and function one way, and then they go home and they're listening to Adam Carolla,
right?
In place of their local radio station, and somehow that distinction, it just takes time because advertising is such a huge legacy business, and there are a lot of constituencies that are deeply entrenched that don't favor disruption. Let's face it, they call it disruption because it's disruptive. The other thing I want to say is you said that it's finally twisting to kind of a content angle. I think it's always been a content thing. It's always been a content thing. I'm writing a post for my blog, hopefully today, on this very issue because, radio people are obsessed with this notion of local. And if you really study the history of radio, you realize that the reason why radio people are so obsessed by local as opposed to content is because the vast majority of radio people are baby boomers. And baby boomers grew up in a time when the content orientation of radio had long since moved to television. If you look at the very beginnings of radio, you see it's all content because no one owned radios. It was content that led people to buy the gadgets in the first place. It was professional sporting events. It was fights. It was religious sermons. It was political reporting on elections. Those were the kinds of things that made people buy radio at the very beginning, and that led to Will Rogers and the golden age of radio. They call it the golden age of radio, but really it was the golden age of radio content. And then all that stuff scooted off to television in the 50s, and radio said, well, what do we do now? And it so happened that there was this thing lurking out there that nobody was addressing that was passionate among an underserved audience called teenagers, and it was called rock and roll. So the birth of radio as we're thinking about it today really had to do with radio's embracing of two things, rock and roll and teenagers. And that's what the cultural reference of people in broadcasting to local on radio is today. It's that era. So for people to look back and say, well, the problem is we're too vanilla, we're too much national programming, we're not locally, we voice track, that's horrible. We don't have enough local content. I say, well, this is only one phase of radio's history. This is not all of radio's history. The reason why people see it this way is because they're baby boomers, and that's the radio they grew up with. Well, guess what? Digital natives didn't grow up with that vision of radio. They grew up with a vision of radio that was surrounded by tons of other technology, all of which is digital.
I have to, before I forget, I want to share a story with you guys. We've had some media buyers that have started commercially using a product that we offer for measurement. Basically, same way they're measuring their banner ads, they're using it to measure the podcast media. And of course, streaming has had its own measurement stuff for a while. And I got a call from the from the company, and she says, "Yeah, we're putting like 30 of our radio stations up on this on our system that we've basically we're paying us for." And she says the radio folks are freaking out because they are now going to have their digital media actually measured, and the radio folks are freaking out a little bit over that because they've been so used to market share by Nielsen or however they've gotten it. Now that they're entering the digital world, they're having to play in the digital big boy space, and she thought it was pretty ironic. And I hadn't really thought about the radio folks freaking out about being measured, but we've kind of assumed it from the beginning. We know we're going to get measured. That's because we're the content is typically bought by digital buyers, but as more radio buyers buy, they're applying digital measurement standards. So it's kind of like this interesting to see the shoe on the other foot.
Yeah, and there's a lot bigger ad budgets on the radio side too.
Right.
I mean, it's a huge opportunity for the industry to tap into that radio budget too, for digital audio type opportunities.
Yeah.
So, that's the transition from a business side. And Mark, I 100% agree with you on the whole content piece, that it always has been about content. But I think from a technology and content producer side, this transition from radio to digital has been up to like maybe the last couple of years has been focused on, well, what's the cool whiz bang technology, and the users have been just riding along with this at a steady clip of adoption, but it's been kludgy and it's been difficult. It hasn't been easy for people to get access to this content. Like we've talked about on this show many times, there isn't necessarily any kind of a content discovery problem now that I think back in the early days of podcasting that really exists now. There's certainly some improvements that can be made to the space in that way. But now, since apps are on everybody's phones and phone screens are getting bigger and the connections are getting more reliable, that kind of technology piece is kind of drifting away. And now, like you say, I think we're coming into a golden age of digital audio, I think is what's happening, and it's centered around content.
It's so interesting because people need to study more history, and if they study more history, they'll recognize this for what it is. The origins of digital audio and people's response to that and the way it plays with the audience is identical to the origins of radio back in the 20s. I mean, radio. Remember ham radio? That was the origin of radio. I mean, originally people were saying, this radio thing, the problem with it is that you can't go one-to-one. It's just, it's too broad. What are you going to do with that? And God forbid we don't want advertising on that because that's so, that's so just wrong.
It's going to spoil it.
There was even, I mean, the beginnings of radio, as we know it now, was about hobbyists. It was about enthusiasts. It was about young men, primarily. There was even an expression for women whose husbands or boyfriends were overly enthusiastic about radio. They were called radio widows. I mean, if you don't see the parallels between, what was and radio was the gadget. Radio was the iPhone of its time. The literal gadget was. So people need to see that this is coming around again. And when you see that it's coming around again, you recognize that it's part of the same thing. It's not a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
So that
makes sense.
It does, but it is interesting how the space is growing because do you think in the beginning when podcasting kind of popped onto the scene and it become a genre, do you think that the radio folks initially were kind of like, but it didn't take them too long to figure it out, but I think they're pretty much on board now. It's just another distribution method for them, isn't it?
Well, I could go on and on about that because, first of all, I regret the fact that podcasting is called podcasting because not only is it an awful name on its own right, but it's a name that creates distance from the greater audio universe of which radio is the primary part. I wish that didn't exist, quite frankly, because it was easy at the beginning. And again, in part because of what Rob said about technology, the technology leading, RSS technology. You got to be kidding me.
Right.
And it just erects barriers. I mean, even today, I've done surveys asking people using the word podcasting, because if we can't use the word podcasting now, 10 to 15 years later, when can we use it?
Right.
And people still don't know what it means. I remember having a conversation with the guy who runs the LA Podcast Fest.
Yeah.
And I said, what's the best thing about the LA Podcast Fest? He said, you can have a room full of people, all of whom know what a podcasting is. And I said, well, that's more of a problem than it is an asset. So I think that, to say that radio broadcasters are on board is not really true. I think the larger issue is that the people in the audio space don't realize they're part of one big family, and they haven't tried hard enough to speak with one big voice.
I think, too, is, I think a number of folks, and let's call them media creators versus podcasters.
I like that.
I think that
I'm going to write that down.
I think the media creators are starting to realize that, what they're really doing. And of course, I was guilty of it for years, Geek News Central podcast. Well, it's really not the Geek News Central podcast, it's the Geek News Central show.
Yeah, right.
So this is the new media show. It's a show. The how it gets to the netherworlds is, that's the podcasting part, but we don't have to say that anymore, largely because, they can just, they just click and play. But, I think a lot of folks are starting to realize that. So you're seeing lots and lots of shows that are really kind of got their head screwed on straight, are really just making sure that their brand is what sticks out there, and they promote the brand, and people will get it. The multitude, 100 different ways they can get the content, just like anything else they do today.
Right. In some ways, too many ways. I think there's an advantage to having the best ways and the other ways. Well, and that's, I think, an important distinction.
But there is, we see it in the data. The 500-pound gorilla is definitely Apple and iTunes and the podcast app, and sadly, Android has lagged a little bit behind on the mobile side. But that could be changing over time as they get their act together. But we'll see how this percentage is. But for a while there, it was iTunes, the desktop platform. And now that is, that has changed. The mobile side is definitely on top of things. But, that's the 500-pound gorilla is plus and minus for the space as well.
So, Mark, one thing I wanted to make sure we talked about on the show today was what the opportunity is for radio in the digital side. They've been lagging, as we can all agree. And I know you've been very, very vocal about focusing on content and not necessarily being as concerned about being, let me say, kind of the traditional norms of radio, kind of just being local versus and not being national, or walking those delicate pathways as you look at broadcast radio today. What do you believe that the radio side is going to do to kind of adapt to this new world? And I know we've been talking about this topic for years, but is there anything new that you're seeing that's happening on the traditional radio side to move more towards digital?
Of course, I get to ask you all these questions on June 4th, right?
Exactly.
So we'll turn it around.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, the opportunities for radio in this space are limitless, which is part of the problem, because limitless opportunities make people very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Such is the nature of no limits. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that the opportunities for radio and digital audio, let me back up. The opportunities for radio and digital platforms are not limited to audio. To a degree, they're limited to integrating the power of the radio brand, which exists largely on the air, through digital platforms with consumers who inhabit those platforms.
Yep.
Clear Channel, in some ways, does this extraordinarily well with some of their iHeart radio show, the concert that they had in Las Vegas, and some of the events that they have with artists and so on. The integration is unbelievable across all those stations, across all their platforms, through social media, integrated with the label, integrated with an artist, integrated with an advertiser. I mean, the power of radio to integrate across platforms should not be underestimated. It's not simply, what else do we do on digital audio that we're not already doing? although that's part of it. So that's part one. In terms of, if your question is about digital audio specifically, then I would say that too is fairly limitless. It's constrained right now, as you know, by the fact that licensing rates, music licensing rates, are so incredibly onerous that stations, broadcasters are discouraged from doing anything in that space because the ability to monetize is so incredibly far out of reach. So as a fallback, they repurpose their own over-the-air station, which, in my mind, fine. I could argue that that's the least important thing they should do, since it's already over the air. That the opportunity exists to put different things out on digital audio that aren't redundant to what's on over the air and satisfy more needs for the people who come to the store over the air. That's one option. Another option is to say, the technology exists to personalize this content. The technology exists for you to skip songs. That technology exists. But broadcasters generally don't want to embrace it because if you start skipping songs, you enter a different category for music licensing purposes, a much more expensive category. The category that Pandora avoids, that category. So as a result, they're discouraged from doing it. So their exploration is primarily to repurpose their own content and to drop, full-length versions of their shows in the form of podcasts in archive form, which I think is, unfortunately, not the best use of the medium. Especially when it's sitting there in the equivalent of an archive, a library on a radio station site that says podcast at the top.
One thing I had a new listener to my regular show that works at BMI, and I sent him an email saying, hey, what's the inside talk about licensing? Of course, BMI is one of the 4 different entities you have to get a license on to play mainstream music on a show, maybe one of 3 or one of 4, whatever it is. But I said, what's the scuttlebutt? What's the rumor, behind the scenes there? And he kind of did some querying around, and essentially they just think the space is too small to have a dedicated category for us to be able to make it easy to do the licensing. And you can do it, but it's very, very painful and not without some risk. And they seem to think that the space is small enough that they're not going to go after people that are actually playing mainstream music, copyright music in their content. Now, I don't know. I'm pretty critical of the RIAA on a regular basis. So I don't think I'll ever be playing any music in my show just because of the simple fact that they'll probably come after me. But so do you think they'll ever get to the point where they're going to make it easy for us that, this downloadable part when that media is being served from a physical file?
Are you talking about for the media creators of the world like you?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, on the one hand, they don't see it as that big of an issue. On the other hand, technology enables them to monitor everything that comes over the internet and to roadblock anything that they believe is their property.
Right.
I know for HiVio last year, my Audio Future Festival in San Diego in June, last year we did a Google Hangout. We live streamed the whole thing, and that was when Google Hangouts had to be 4-hour increments. So the first 4 hours, it got flagged by Google. It's because we had music in between the interview segments, and we didn't pot down the audio.
And they bounced you.
Google, just because it was ambient music in the background, it wasn't at all fed into the feed.
Right.
But we got flagged for that. So they're listening, whether they tell you it matters or not.
Yeah, I agree. And my whole thing was we're just trying to find vehicles. I work with a lot of content creators, and they're all, some of them want to play top 40, and I'm just like, well, you can't, not yet. And not without a lot of work. Now, some folks have got away with playing cover music and that type of stuff, but the content I'm really interested in is a talk. But there's a lot of people that love someone that's kind of playing DJ in a show that they're doing, and you just don't see those kinds of shows, at least legally, being able to do the content. But there's just no real easy way to do the licensing pay RIII, pay ASCAP, pay BMI. There's just no easy way to do it.
Oh, I would love to do, some promotional videos for my clients. But
Yep.
it's I know that it would be far easier to get blocked than to be legal, which is, I think, very strange.
And I think,
I do kind of wonder over time, kind of taking a little higher view on this topic. What's going to happen over time as users become more inclined to use their portable devices and their tablets and things to listen to music, that the market for music radio stations will decline. I don't know, Mark, what do you think about that? Is that something that you think is inevitable, that the concept of a specific genre radio station, like a rock or a country station, in a local market will eventually not be viable anymore, just because of Pandora and Spotify and iTunes? And I mean, as that medium on the digital side grows, it feels like that the radio piece may be shifting away from that type of content being over the air, though it is cheaper, I think, probably to deliver music over the air because it's more controllable. And
it's also cheaper.
Yeah,
right.
It's cheaper currently. But is that going to shift radio, what we know broadcast radio, over more to spoken word?
My belief has always been that that's exactly what we're going to see. That we're first of all, I don't want to put a stake in the heart of music radio just yet. That said, because also, what we mean by music radio varies. A lot of music radio stations have morning shows that are, hugely entertaining and compelling.
That's true. Yeah.
Yet they're built around music. A lot of stations have gone out of their way to have personalities who are foreground personalities that wrap around the music. So, I will say, for any station that's literally just a music box and virtually nothing else, yes, their days are numbered. Absolutely. And how are things going to fare down the road? We're already seeing that starting to play out. More news, more talk, more sports, more religious, more, ironically, more of the things that radio was at the very beginning.
Yeah.
More non-music. I don't like the term spoken word either. That and podcasting are in the same miserable category for me. But I like to refer to it as non-music content. So yes, I think we're going to see a lot more non-music, hear a lot more non-music content on the radio going forward. We're also going to see, I think, more ethnic content. By that I mean more Hispanic, more Spanish language content, because I think that's an area where there will be plenty of music stations in the future.
One thing we see on the Hispanic side in the podcasting space is that there's not a lot of Hispanic podcasts, but those the ones that are available, man, they do huge. Adam Carolla would cry. They do an incredible amount of traffic. So those markets are very prime for a lot of influx of content. I think it's an undermet market, to be honest with you, myself.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of new content that are coming out from other countries around the world that are in local language, content. So there's growth of the digital audio podcast genre around the world. I know, working at Windows Phone for many years, I got, over the last 2 or 3 years, I saw this huge spike in podcasts that were being created in countries all over the world, and everybody wanted to get on the Windows Phone platform because the Windows Phone was selling pretty well over in Europe and Asia and those places. So I think that's a whole other conversation. I mean, we've been really focused on what's happening in the U.S. With this, because we tend to do kind of lead the world, but there is this kind of delayed effect that's happening as more people around the world get these digital technology devices as well.
I think too, you've got a large expat community in every country. You've got every so you have those buckets of people in each country that are looking for content, and it could be created right in within the country, but oftentimes they reach back to whatever the mother country is. So
that's right. That's right.
So, Mark, you think then, I know that I've done some consulting recently, and one thing I've been paying attention to is when I go into offices is something's always playing. There's either a radio station or something playing. So I always ask, what do you guys, is that Pandora? Is that, what are you guys listening to? And, obviously folks are in their cubicles with their earphones in, but oftentimes companies now are just streaming Pandora. Now I'm sure there's probably some licensing issues there, but that being said, they're not tuned into FM 100 in their local town. They're just playing a music mix. So that to me is big in itself.
Oh yeah, there's near my office. There's a frozen yogurt place. I went in there and I heard some peculiar music. I said, "What are you playing?" And she said, "It's Pandora." And I said, "That's," and she said, "But we have the plug-in that blocks all the ads." And I thought, "Oh, that's fabulous."
Really?
Great.
Wow.
Well,
fabulous.
And long story short, that we don't even want to talk about the other laws that they're probably breaking from.
Yes, so they're violating the law by playing it in their space, number one.
Yeah.
Violating it again by blocking the ads, and meanwhile they're selling a bunch of frozen yogurt. But I will say they're not listening to radio. You're right.
Right.
They're not playing radio. I do still hear radio stations played in various merchants around town and so on. But yeah, I mean it's more common for people to take control of their music. Look, isn't that the truth of it? That it's more common for people to take control, period, where they have the will and the way. And I got to add, and this is really super important, where it's easy. And that's one of the things that broadcasters really lean on. The fact that radio, an average of 5 in every household, of 800 million in the U.S., is the easiest thing in the world. It's incredibly familiar. It's part of everybody's life. It's forced on you when you buy a car. Even if you're not interested in it, there it is.
Yep.
Which, by the way, was a strategy adopted by SiriusXM, but that's a different story. So the fact that it's so familiar and so easy, this is why, while we see the time spent listening to radio declining, we see still relatively healthy reach for radio, because you're almost crazy to avoid it. It's like a quarter on the floor in front of you. Are you really not going to pick it up?
I think where the battle for the television is HDMI 1. In other words, whatever the first plug you plug into your TV, that when it turns on, that's where it goes to. The same analogy can be made for the car. The battle's for the dashboard. What's going to come up when you turn on? Is it going to be Ford Sync, or is it going to be the FM? That's to me is where the ultimate battle is going to break down in the vehicle, because most of the time now we're walking in the vehicle and my kids are plugging into their mobile devices. I'm listening to whatever I want to listen to. And the radio in my car is basically who the driver's controlling. I'm sure that's the same way in many families' homes. But at some point, we're going to have all cars are going to have more choices on the dashboard. And I think that's another indication that radio is going to be marginalized a little bit more. Not as, there's still, it's going to be the go-to thing for, a certain generation of people. But as people get older, my daughter, who's 22, I guarantee you she's not listening to an AM/FM station.
Yeah. Well, that and plus, as you see over the next 10 to 15 years, as autonomous cars become more and more in there, being a part of what people don't drive around, but they get around, that's going to free up people's hands and attention to do other things. I mean, that's looking into the future pretty significantly. I don't think autonomous cars are right around the corner or anything like that, but it does cause you to pause and think, what does the future really look like in the car for this stuff? And I think it's really, really bright. It may be a little rocky for the next few years because people are having to hold their phones and control the dashboard with their phones, and it's kind of a dangerous kind of scenario because they're having to drive and try and do this. And I think that the opportunity is to create dashboard experiences that make it safer for people to drive and consume this content. And I think that the government's going to require it. Actually, it's not going to be an option. But I think the long-term future is people do have free hands in the car and the ability to pay attention to something else.
Well, this is why Apple and Google want to get their mitts on the car dash so bad, right? I mean, I would love nothing more than a company like IDEO to come in and make that experience as it should be, because it is so far from that now. I'm not at all impressed by the ability of the automakers to develop technology that's built to be used by a consumer unless it involves a steering wheel and a brake, I can tell you. Now, you were talking, though, about all the choices and how that's going to potentially erode radio and so on. In my view, it's not the choices so much. I'm not really worried about choices. I'd be worried about how easy it is to do what I want to do.
Yep.
And how compelling the content is that makes it worth consuming in the first place. Because, my inclination to act as a consumer is a function of those two things. How much do I want it? And how many hoops do I have to go through to get it, right?
Yep.
Those are the two things. Right now with radio, it's incredibly easy as long as you accept that I can't get exactly what I want right now. I've got to get what the programmer deems best for me and many people like me. So those are the two things that I think are really critical. And that's why, in my presentation that I'm going to be showing at the Hyvio event in June, I'm going to be going through some of the research on long tail. And the research on long tail is really interesting, done by Anita Albers at Harvard, because what she's learned is that while the ability of media creators or content creators to create more content is really proliferated, in other words, the long tail has gotten a lot longer, the original theory behind long tail is that the revenue from that long tail, the tail will get thicker. The revenue will get thicker, because as the tail gets longer, more people get what they want, and there's more capacity to deliver to that and more taste for that. More revenue will be generated there and so on. It turns out that's not what's happening. What's happening is quite the opposite. What's happening is, yes, the tail's getting longer. There are more long tail things, but many of those things deliver almost no units, almost no copies, almost no audience, almost no attention. And in fact, what's happening is the short head is becoming more valuable as the long tail gets ever longer, which is where you see things like blockbuster movies. You see things like music artists. For example, in her data in 2011, there were 103 titles that were downloaded more than 1 million times. 103 titles downloaded more than 1 million times, accounting for 15% of all download revenue. 103 titles. That's the short head. So the opportunity here is not so, from a revenue standpoint, not to be at the end of a long tail, but to be at the top of the short head. That's why sports is more profitable than ever before. That's why TV advertising continues to go up as attention goes down. That's why movie blockbusters are huge, and so on and so on and so on. That's why Netflix, a company all about long tail, turns around and puts $100 million in a House of Cards because it wants a hit.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, it's really counterintuitive to what you really think is going on in the market. But if you really back up and you think about it, I think people are so busy and they're so lacking in the ability to comprehend so much selection that they tend to gravitate towards what's familiar and what's popular. And I think, I don't think you have to look any further than what's happening with the phone platforms today. It's iOS and Android, right? There's two choices now, where I think in the past we would have been seeing probably 5 or 6 or 7 mobile phone operating systems. People are narrowing their choice based on quality. I think that's what's happening.
Also, I've got to jump in there because I think this leads to the whole question of discovery. Because the whole notion is that with the oceans of content, discovery is what everyone wants because everyone's tired of hearing the same old songs on the radio and so on. Look, they're tired of hearing the same old songs on the radio, and then look at the top of the iTunes charts.
Right.
It's the same old songs on the radio. The discovery is in many ways an overstated myth. The research indicates that most people get their music discovery from radio. Well, is that because radio is so good at introducing people to new music? No, it's because most people's appetite for new music isn't nearly what we think of when we think of the word discovery with capital letters. Most people think a new song is a song that's been out a year, 2 years. So discovery is really, in many ways, overrated, and we go too far out of our way to facilitate it. Most people are just trying to make it through the day in the most familiar, simplest way possible, with a little bit of entertainment, a little bit of information. And you know, the catch is, the hard part is to be on that short list. That's the hard part, and that's what's so desirable. For example, let's talk about, a lot of the most popular podcasts, as you know, emanate from either personalities, shows that are famous in other ways for other reasons on other platforms.
Of course.
Right? They're either stars, these many comics that are creating their own podcasts. These are established personalities, Aisha Tyler, Adam Carolla. These are people who have followings that they bring to the podcast platform, but their followings are built from television, from radio, from wherever they're from, mass media of some kind. That's where these followings come from. And then the podcast is kind of an additional distribution channel that adds more halo to the already large halo, but it doesn't create the halo. That it's what's rare are the Welcome to Night Vales of the world. That's the rarity, something that explodes organically, that originates from the world of podcasting. That's what's weird.
I got basically two things to follow up with what you guys were just talking about the long tail. What's kind of interesting is what we see, and to put it into the podcast space, but, to look at the long tail from a podcasting genre, is that the majority of the content, maybe 97 or 98% of the content that's being produced and published by content creators in what I would call the traditional podcast channel, their content's consumed about 90% of it's being consumed in like the first 3 days it's online. There's a small percentage that have a really long tail, very, very small. And those that have that long tail where it's consumed a couple months later have done real well. They have content that's truly evergreen. But at the same time, going back to what you're just talking about on the, the top tier, the 100 million people or 100 million sales or downloads and on the top 15%, what I've seen is that you've got the Adam Carollas, you've got the Mark Maroons, you've got all these guys that are, kind of at the top of the food chain in each specific genre. They're the guys you see in the top 10 list. They do great numbers, don't get me wrong. But what I think the community and what's largely missed is that you've got 200,000 other content creators that are basically below that top 2% that are out there creating content who are reaching incredible breadths of society. I think we did some data polls recently where just our small 20,000 or so shows that we work with was reaching something like 54 million individual folks every month from a breadth standpoint. Adam Carolla doesn't reach 54 million people a month. So the media buyers are all gravitating towards buying Adam's content or these top guys' contents, but they're missing the big picture about this huge breadth. And so oftentimes I get a media buyer call me and say, oh, I only want shows that have 10,000 or above listeners. I'm like, well, sorry, that's, I'm going to have a very short spreadsheet to send you. But if you're willing to take shows that are 1,000 to 3,000, I can send you multitude thousands of shows that reach numbers. And the audience is largely, they may overlap a little bit, but not very much. And once we can get the media buyers to understand that, the whole space is going to change. But
I don't know. I don't know if it's exactly fair to compare one show and the millions that it reaches with 20,000 shows and the millions that they reach. That's that you can stack that pile so high that nobody can overcome it. But I get your point. I think ultimately the question is going to be that this is where measurement comes in, right?
Right.
This is where the ability to say, how do we make a buy such that we can make that buy efficiently and effectively? Clearly, that buy is going to have to be across a large number of people, unless we're in some specialty category, which is a whole different discussion. I'm quite aware that a lot of podcasting is in a specialty category, and I'm further quite aware that a lot of podcasting is in categories where the purpose isn't to monetize through advertising. The purpose is to, as Gary Vaynerchuk once told me, to monetize on the second level, as he put it. The fact that we have a podcast enables us to get more people at our event, like Slate does, or get more people to come out to our shows at the Improv,
right?
Like Kevin Smith does. So there is that layer, and then the third layer is, I'm a business person, let's say, and I want a podcast because I have a tribe of people who follow my opinions, and those are it's part of my client filter. Right. To bring people down to clients from people who don't know me. Yesterday, I was asked by a company, business-to-business company, and they have an app that they're interested in distributing. And they said, how should we go about? They did some Q&A. I did a Q&A with them, and all of a sudden, all these inquiries came into them from across the world, and they were so impressed. And they said, how should we go about getting the word out to potential people about this app that we're trying to sell to them, business to business? And I said, well, are you opting people into anything? Are you introducing people to a stream of content that you provide for free? Are you trying to nurture relationships with people who don't know you? Or are you simply, putting banner ads in radio industry trades? And they said all of that. Oh, those are good ideas. And I said, well, I didn't invent any of these. Yeah. And I may not even do the best job at fulfilling any of these, but that's how you do it. I mean, so my point is that not everybody wants to be Adam Carolla in the podcast space. I get that. But you know what? But every radio broadcaster should want to be Adam Carolla.
Yeah, it's true.
And by the way, here's a whole other angle that we haven't talked about. I see no reason why everything that's worthwhile in a podcast shouldn't be equally worthwhile over the air.
I agree.
On the radio. And I really wonder when broadcasters are going to look at the metrics that you see on podcasting and say, exactly how much audience does Adam Carolla need to generate before we can find a way to put him on the radio that doesn't require him to be in a studio from 6 to 10 a.m. 5 days a week.
I've dabbled with that here and tried to reach out to some traditional AM stations and said, hey, okay, the weekend time, obviously that's usually you're trying to sell that. I said, here's the content I have. And they're like, oh, yeah, we'll do it. But, get your checkbook out. And I'm like, I'm not writing you a check. I'm going to add added value. But that's not the way they look at it now. They look at Saturdays as a place for companies to come in and spend money and get airtime and,
I played that game for many years with my own show. I've lived in the radio world and the podcasting world at the same time, and it's something that can be done. I mean, I did it for many years. And
so, Rob, did you buy time to clear your show on AM stations?
I did on a few stations, and I certainly tried to do it on a bunch of others, and I just had to make a business decision about whether or not it was worth it to pay $1,200 an hour, or versus what kind of advertising I could get. It was on the weekends, right? It was called lifestyle programming, and they were all these radio stations. I mean, even the biggest stations up in Seattle were doing the same thing. They were selling weekend airtime because they were looking for cooking shows and gardening shows and shows talking about computer technology.
I gotta interrupt you because what they're looking for aren't cooking shows or gardening shows. What they're looking for is someone to walk into their office with $1,200.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. That's what they were looking for. But it was this kind of weird conversation because they're a radio station. They're a content company, but it's almost like they didn't value the content that much. It was just more of just getting cash in the door.
Yeah, they valued the check, and that's what I told the guy that I said, "You want my check, you don't want my content." And I says, "Someday maybe you'll want my content, and then you can write me a check."
Look at it this way. Look at it this way. If you were, a broadcaster, a medium-sized broadcaster, let's say, and you said, I want to try something new. I want to spend my overnights from midnight to 6 a.m. And I want to take, whatever Todd tells me are your, 5 most entertaining podcasts, 6 most entertaining, whatever the length of the podcast, such that it adds up to 6 hours.
Right.
And I want to carry those, and I'm going to monetize those, and you'll give them to me for nothing because, you want the distribution. And I get to monetize those, and I put them on overnight because, otherwise I'm just going to have music and a voice track anyway.
Sign me up.
I don't know why somebody doesn't do that.
Me neither.
Well, actually, back in 2005, 2006, there was a radio station in San Francisco. I'm trying to remember where it was through that was putting podcasts on the air.
Yeah.
It was an experiment, I believe. I think maybe Clear Channel was involved in it at one point.
I don't think it was Clear. I think it was an independent channel, but I had my content on, and I had to go through the whole, I guess we can say it here, butt pain of cutting it up to make it fit their model. The hash marks you have to hit. So
yeah, and they had a tool that you would go in and you would upload your show, and they would put it in their queue to play on the air. And I submitted my show a few times, and I know I had a bunch of other friends that did the same thing. And back then, it wasn't that big a deal for me. I was already on the XM Satellite Radio Network. I was already on about 10 or 12 broadcast stations through satellite syndication, and was streaming live, like a simulated live kind of a broadcast where it was like timed to a certain hour and day of the week, so people that were tuning in were think it was live, but it was really playing a pre-recorded program. So there was a bunch of stuff that I was doing back in the early days that I don't know if we're going to come back to that though, because
I know all about that station, and that was
you do?
CBS
Okay, well, tell us all about it.
That was a CBS station. I don't remember what it was called, but it was a CBS station in the Bay Area. It was an AM station. And I remember the head of programming for CBS at the time saying to me that this was it wasn't anything to do with him. It was the digital team that put this together. And he said, my job is to get ratings, and his job is to, create a news release. And that's really what it was. It was a stunt. And it was a stunt because what I'm talking about is not stringing one podcast after another together, no matter who votes for it or who selects it or who filters it all day long. I'm saying, can we not take Adam Carolla? Can we not take Kevin Smith? Can we not take Aisha Tyler? Can we not take 3 other shows like that and filter and place them between midnight and 6 a.m.? In other words, I'm saying 6 superstar shows between midnight and 6 a.m. There's enough of these shows built up over time such that you can even strip them nightly, and you can even repeat them. Who cares? It's midnight to 6.
Right.
That's a whole different thing. That has never been done. Now what you've allowed me to do as a broadcaster is to say, now I've got a nighttime package. Now I've got another attraction. Now I'm the place where you can go to hear this particular package overnight. Now the benefit for the podcaster, and this is when the difficulty of being in podcasting to a large degree is if you've got something real good, the difficulty is introducing it to people.
Right.
The difficulty is getting people to sample it, because audio is so incredibly ridiculously difficult to sample because one picture takes 1,000 words. Being on the radio creates sampling because the program becomes a roadblock. The program becomes an obstacle. This is how all radio works. A show goes on, it takes a month, 6 months, 2 years to happen. And then after a month, 6 months, 2 years, it either succeeds or it doesn't. I was in Philadelphia when Howard Stern came on the air, and there were people there who said, it'll never work, it's a New York show. It took a year. By the way, people forget, it took a year for that show to overcome the leading show in the market, and then it was all over. And then people said, no, it'll never work in LA, it's an East Coast show. And then people said, no, it'll never work in San Diego, it's a big city show. No, it'll never work in the middle of the country, and so on and so forth, until they realize, oh, it works everywhere. So I think that what I'm describing is not the San Francisco, news release strategy of 2005 or whatever it was. It's an opportunity to say, if we're in the content business and we're in the audience development business, shouldn't we embrace all the content that's out there? And you've got Aisha Tyler, every couple of weeks creating an hour-long audio experience for free. And she would love, I'm sure, to be overnight on our radio station. Why not do that?
Well, you're seeing some of that being done by the public radio side, where they'll take like the Tobolowsky Files is a good example. That was a podcast and that they put on the air. I think that it's really interesting. I think if you really follow public radio, it's been a really good example, I think, of what you're talking about, Mark. And I think they've been able to carve out a significant niche in culture and radio listening around the country because of this more open to dual strategy that they have around podcasts and the radio side. So I don't know what you think about that, about how public radio plays into this in helping to educate the more traditional radio broadcasters.
I think that's true. I think, where's the line between 99% Invisible, the podcast, and the radio show? I mean, the folks at PRX are all over this, putting stuff on that, kind of crossing that boundary between podcasting and radio and recognizing the value of people who create podcasts as a kind of a farm team for broadcast, which is absolutely what it is. So I think you're right about that. Here's what's missing. What's missing is the most popular content in the audio space is entertainment content.
Yep.
That's the most popular content. And by the way, even to a degree, information content that's popular in the audio space is usually entertaining. People think there's a big line between news and entertainment. Especially after you get past a certain age, when you're listening to news, it's because you're being entertained by it. It's just a different flavor of entertainment. I mean, if Bill O'Reilly's not an entertainer, I don't know what he is. Come on now.
Yeah.
So I think what's missing in the public radio space is there's no place for Kevin Smith. There's barely a place for Mark Maron, but there's no place for Kevin Smith. There's no place for Aisha Tyler, because these things are the less they have to do with public service, the less public radio, public media finds them to be a match. And I'm not debating that. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I would look on the other side and say, well, if it has no public service, but it's just purely, unambiguously, and unapologetically entertaining, why in the world can we find a place for it on the radio?
Well, Mark, one comment that I have on that, though, is that for Kevin Smith or Aisha Tyler and probably more so Kevin Smith, to move over to broadcast, he's going to have to change his content, because what he does on his show and what a lot of podcasters do, even Mark Maron and Adam Carolla, they couldn't air on broadcast radio because of the FCC. So
that's true.
They're going to have
to solutions to that, Rob.
Change the content that they make. And I don't see those guys really wanting to do that. Go over to broadcast and having to essentially neuter their shows. I know at Podcast One, we are trying to kind of walk this line between having explicit shows and family safe shows. So we have shows that hosts that are doing two shows. So one's a clean show version, and one's a naughty show, that has explicit language in it. So, the audience can choose which one that they want, right? So I think your point really is taken, that I think on the podcasting side, it's the Wild West. They can do whatever they want to do around, language and topics. But once it moves over to broadcast, they have to be a little bit more cautious on what they say and what they do, because it's just it's the FCC. I'm
so glad you mentioned that. Because I do want to talk about that. Kevin Smith's a perfect example because I get that it's bluer on the podcast, but it's bluer on the podcast because it can be bluer on the podcast. I mean,
That's right.
Kevin Smith personally said to me, quote, "I would love to be on the radio." Here's a guy who is one of American radio's morning radio's favorite guests because he always delivers and he's always awesome. So he does a ton of radio. He just doesn't put his own content on the radio. Now, yes, it can be the Wild West, but he said to me flat out, he said, maybe they think I can't work, without saying the F word. He said, I can. And in fact, I would argue to you that the reason why it's the Wild West is because it can be the Wild West. Howard Stern says the F word now because he can.
Right.
If Howard Stern were back on the radio, he would not. Any of these guys, I'll bet if I sit in front of Kevin Smith right now, I've already done it with Kevin Smith, but let's say Aisha Tyler and say, Aisha, if we had the opportunity to clean up your show to put your show on the radio, can you clean it up a smidge if it means it gets on the radio? I think Aisha would look at me and say, hell yes. Well, heck yes. So in other words, I think what I'm trying to argue is that the reason why these shows are the way they are is not only because these guys prefer to work this way, because these guys aren't stupid. I think it's because these guys have the freedom to work this way.
Right.
And if you said to these guys, look, do what you do. We want what you do. We don't want something that isn't what you do. But we have certain rules legally we need to live by in order to give you the benefit of this incredible reach called radio. Can you live by those rules? They will say yes.
I think some of them, especially the guys that came from broadcast or came from radio before, many of them never want to go back because of maybe I shouldn't say politics, the business, the contracts, all that stuff. I think I think that's why Adam's being so successful. He is his own man. He doesn't have to worry about what the boss in the upper floor is going to say about today's show. And that's what makes it so beautiful.
Todd, here's the thing, Todd.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that, when you are the morning show for a station in L.A., as Adam was, to say nothing of the fact that he followed up Howard, which is a whole other, disaster.
Right.
But you are working for the man.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You have to frame your show according to the way the powers that be want you to frame your show.
Yep.
This is something different. Now, when you're a show that's essentially syndicated, I either take it or I leave it. And I can't tell Dave Ramsey what to do on his show if I'm carrying his show.
Yep.
I can either carry it or not carry it, right?
Yep.
Now, he has to do a show that's legal for the FCC, but my choice is not to tell him what to do. My choice is to carry it or not. So I think the reason why people like Adam say, no, I would never go back to radio is because what he views as going back to radio is, and I've had this conversation with him too, is getting up every day at the crack of dawn and spending 4 hours in front of a microphone trying to do the bidding of the man, watching the ratings every week and so on.
Yep.
And I think for a lot of these guys, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's just inhuman.
Yeah.
And that's what they're really enjoying. That, if I'm Mark Maron, if I'm Kevin Smith, I can do a couple hours here and there. I can create some great stuff, and then I can go about my life.
Yep.
There's no 4-hour commitment. There's no, person holding the ratings over me every night. There's no guy in the corner office yelling at me to do less of this and more of this. So that's that's the freedom you're talking about. That's why I'm saying if you're creating a show and it's a good show and it's got a good following, what I'm buying from you is essentially your syndicated show.
Yeah.
All I ask is that you be legal. All I'm interested in is nurturing, is milking your following and adding to your following. Is that okay with you? Answer yes.
Because what he's going to do is what's going to happen is, from someone called me and say, hey, we want your tech show, for radio. For me, that's an opportunity. For me, it's a distribution and exposure opportunity that really money can't. Well, money can buy, but it's money you don't have to spend. I guess that's a better word.
This is why I'm shouting and screaming and hopping up and down, is because all of this content is created already by someone for free.
Right.
I mean, why in the world? And if some of it hits, I mean, what is growth hacking? What is the way that startups are starting nowadays? They're starting by A/B tests. They're starting by lean startup principles. They're starting by experiments. They're putting it out there. They're seeing what happens. They're fixing it. They're getting rid of it. They're killing it young.
Yep.
They're doing all this stuff. Well, that's what podcasts are.
That's right.
And if you've got a podcast that hits big, if you've got, I mean, I don't know right now why Welcome to Night Vale isn't on public radio right now. My guess is that they've said no. My guess is Night Vale. My guess is Joe and the guys at Night Vale have said no. And that's why it's not on public radio, because I can't imagine that anything at the top of the iTunes rankings wouldn't be catnip for public broadcasting.
And I think, too, if we go back and look at this space, a lot of these guys are anti-establishment. So, you go back to 2004, the first podcast New Media Expo was like what we're done, beat down the man. So, that was already a large part of the culture of this space. And as naive as we were, it is it's just the way the community is. And so
I think that's how
everybody's anti-establishment right up until the establishment calls
and writes a check, right?
That's right. Hey, I also wanted to ask and talk about here, Mark, do you think that we will see a similar thing happen to the I know you hate the term spoken word side of the fence here, or non-music content? Will we see a Pandora kind of scale of a media property or a platform, evolve? We haven't really seen it other than iTunes, and I think what's happening with iTunes and the podcast app is that it's not growing at a tremendous rate, and I think there's other third-party platforms that are starting to move up and gain market share in the on-demand podcasting space. Do you think that we will see a Pandora-like company or platform, emerge as the XM or Sirius of on-demand radio?
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure. I know there's some platforms out there. One of my favorites is Agogo, agogo.com, which really does try and fulfill what you're describing, because unlike Stitcher, unlike the iTunes podcast app, it kind of begins, it introduces stuff to you that they think you might like based on the stuff you already like. And it doesn't recommend, you don't have to go and click here to sign up for a whole new podcast. Stuff comes at you via the internet like magic. And it's really interesting. Now, that said, I think, again, audio is a whole different thing from music. I should say, obviously, non-music is a whole different thing from music. The biggest problem that I see is that music has these things called hooks. That's the 5 to 7 second, recognizable portion of that song. If you tune in, that's the part of the song that you say, yes, I know that song. I know 3.5 minutes because I know that 5 to 7 seconds. There is no similar thing for non-music audio. You can't sample it that way. You have to listen to a longer piece of it in order to appreciate it, and that becomes a problem because that becomes an obstacle. For me to know that a podcast is worth listening to, how do I know that?
Yeah.
I need to sample it. Somebody can recommend it to me, but how many people actually do that? More likely, I know Kevin Smith. I like Kevin Smith, so I'm going to listen to Kevin Smith. I know Aisha Tyler. I like Aisha Tyler. I'm going to listen to Aisha Tyler. There's Night Vale at the top of the iTunes ranking. A lot of people must like it. There's a lot of social proof wrapped up in that. Let me give it a sample. Sampling is really difficult because it takes 1,000 words to create one picture. There's no thumbnail in audio. And that's hugely problematic. And that's why I think what's more likely for the future is that platforms like Pandora weave in content at your option that may be potentially non-music. But even Tom Conrad, the CTO of Pandora last year, told me that because I asked him about this. I said, when are you guys going to gravitate towards something that isn't in the category of music? And he said, of course we could do anything, and I said, okay, but given that you can do anything, let's say you had to choose one thing. And everybody in the audience laughed at me. But then Tom actually tried to answer the question, which I was very impressed at. And he said, well, since so much of what we do is around music, we would probably introduce something that relates to that. And I think he was implying that there would be some musicologist angle to it, some greater perspective on the song you were about to hear or the artist you were about to hear. So some, still in the context of a musical experience. So I don't know. I think that the answer to your question is that I think we're more likely to see audio content disintermediated from platforms that are all about so-called spoken word audio content. Rather than seeing a spoken word Pandora,
right.
I think we're more likely to see disintermediated spoken word content that lives apart from any single platform.
Having talked to the Pandora folks recently, I can tell you their opinion hasn't changed. If they ever introduce true spoken word outside of the genre of music, I'd fall out of my chair. I just don't think they'll ever do it.
And by the way,
Well,
comedy is a different. They've got comedy, but that's a different use case, because comedy is in the category of comedy is in many ways more like music than it is like non-music, because comedy is a series of jokes, just like music is a series of songs. And you don't know most comedians anyway, so you go to that place. And comedy, by the way, is a popular channel on SiriusXM as well. But you go because you want to graze some entertainment, you want to graze some humor, you want to graze something funny, and that it's like what headline news used to be. It's what it is all day long. It's like all news radio. It's all jokes all day long. If you want to graze that, you know exactly what it is. You can pop in and graze it. You don't need to know that the next hour is Kevin Smith.
For years we've been promoting distribution is good. And I still, personally, I believe distribution is good. The more places you are, the more potential for discovery. It's up to the media creator to direct people, once they do find you, to the premium space to listen to you. I guess that's the way I like to phrase it. But we're starting to see some, and it's usually the bigger shows that are reeling in some of their distribution. Do you think that reeling in distribution is good? Do you think, if X show says, I don't want to be listed over here anymore, do you think they're doing a disservice to their audience?
Why would someone say that they don't want to be listed someplace?
It's happening. It's starting to happen.
Well, guys, I can probably talk about that a little bit from what I'm seeing. I think one of the reasons that may be happening here in the future is more of around metrics and tracking and being able to do more advanced things with the programming that may not be as easily supported across all of these platforms. So I think what we're starting to see is a more serious approach from some players in the space that want to enable functionality and metrics and other deeper activities with their audiences that may not be enabled across the whole industry. So there may be business reasons and technology reasons that we see content starting to get pulled out of platforms and focused on specific apps that will enable that kind of functionality. So until this industry kind of consolidates around some newer standards and some newer ways of approaching this, and I think a lot of this rides along, Mark, and you can comment on this around the early days of radio and around broadcast standards and metrics and how things were reported to advertisers and those kind of things. So is there a corollary here that you can see, Mark?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that, well, first of all, again, not every audio experience of this type, I'm trying not to use the term podcast. I wish you guys would single-handedly create an alternative. Not every audio experience of this type is in the business to attract advertising dollars. So for them, it's kind of a moot point. However, for the ones that are trying to scale, which are the ones that are trying to attract advertising dollars, not all distribution is created equal. Of course, not all distribution is created equal anyway, right? The fact that you're located on some block in the internet doesn't presume that block is, heavily trafficked. So to me, like for example, I'll give you for instance, the folks at KCRW that I work with, they have they have plenty of podcasts, but they have some podcasts that are exclusively podcasts that don't go over the air. And most of those are related to the entertainment industry. So I'm thinking, you're in LA, you're at KCRW, you've got a podcast called, the one is called The Business, which is about Hollywood, and they've got a couple of other on the TV business and so on. The Spinoff, it's called. That's purely a podcast, The Spinoff. Why in the world wouldn't you do a deal with The Hollywood Reporter for its digital platform? Why wouldn't you do a deal with Variety? Why wouldn't you do a deal with LA Times to get your content on their platform? That's distribution that's priceless to them. Now, does it fit the parameters you just mentioned, Rob, about necessarily being quantifiable for advertising? Possibly not. But here we're talking about a public radio station whose goal is to attract underwriters and donations from listeners. So for them, especially in those cases that are fairly vertical in terms of the appeal of those podcasts, why not put them in the way of the audience that's interested in that content? That's what distribution should be at its best. Put the show in the way of the audience that's interested in that content, regardless of where that audience happens to be. That's quality distribution. Now, if it can be monetized, if the metrics enable monetization, so much the better. If not, you've got to make a different business decision, which is, can I monetize this on another level?
When I was at NAB, well, at least the last 2 years, the second someone finds out I work with media creators that is in the content business, they're like wanting to talk to me about distribution. And I'm finding that there's this insatiable appetite right now. If you look at the amount of content out there, it's just incredible. There's every genre, every topic, from basket weaving to how to change a motor in your vehicle. I mean, it's the full gambit. So you've got these networks or startups, or even in third countries where they're making their own version of a Roku or a box. And they are so hungry for content. It's amazing to me that as big as this space is, how much demand there is for content across the space. So, for me, I going back to this distribution conversation, I don't care where I'm listened to, as long as I'm listened, because my advertising is in my show, and I may not get paid for that download, but as long as my advertisers kept happy by the action that happens from the advertising, they're going to keep spending money with me. So for me, at least, the dollars make sense, further out from a longevity standpoint. So I just don't understand the drawing back. I do to a certain extent, but again, I don't.
I think the larger issue, though, Todd, is are we thinking of distribution the wrong way? Are we thinking of distribution as, am I on all the aggregator platforms for podcasts or not? Or are we thinking of distribution as, is my content in front of all the people that might be interested in my content wherever they happen to be?
Right.
That, by the way, is not likely to be on a distribution aggregator. That's likely to be on, if I've got a podcast about moms, I've got to be where the moms are.
Right.
If I've got a podcast about Hollywood, I should be where the Hollywood junkies are. That's the fact that I'm on iTunes, the fact that I'm on a podcast aggregator or whatever is fine as far as it goes, but that's like saying being in the Amazon store is my goal. No.
Right. Yeah.
And also, a lot of, a lot of the podcast aggregator platforms are are very platform specific. I mean, I think that the biggest thing that's starting to happen is that there's platforms that are cross-platform now, and it's that's a big step forward. I mean, if you look at even the years I spent at Windows Phone and Zune and stuff, that was very specific to one platform. I mean, you have iTunes on pretty much one platform. Sure, they were on Windows, but it is a very isolated thing, right? The iOS phones and tablets and stuff, and so you see these silos essentially is what's happening. But I think we are starting to see cross-platform platforms starting to come into being. But I think it's still a little early for that for audio.
Can I mention something that I think is that I'm just thinking about right now that is troubling to me, and that is that the silo called iTunes podcasts, the podcast app, sorry, versus a different silo called iTunes, which for some reason includes iTunes Radio.
Yep.
Yet iTunes Radio has no relationship to the podcast app.
Yeah,
so
there you go.
I think that there is some kind of inertia that needs to be reconsidered when we ask not, the fact that these things originated as podcasts, that's we're going to keep it in the ghetto, I would argue, called podcasts, as opposed to this thing called radio, which we're going to put over here with this bounty called iTunes. I don't understand that. And I think that kind of barrier is unfortunate. That kind of barrier is not going to help the space. That kind of barrier isn't necessarily helping consumers because, I mean, who goes to the podcast app when I want to hear something, entertainment or information? Don't I just want to hear something?
Right.
Do I want to hear something in this app or that app, even under the same Apple umbrella? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that there's an opportunity for Apple to rethink this, and an opportunity for Apple to say, what is the audio experience that consumers really would embrace? What is the audio experience that we can enable for them that will be closer to what their appetites are, easier for them to consume, that will encourage them to consume that content, that ultimately will enable our ability to monetize it through iAds or whatever?
Well, Mark, and I think that right there. What you said is really where the opportunity is for a independent company to come in and fill that. Because I agree with you. I think Apple and even other big players in this space are not doing what needs to be done, and I think it leaves an opening for like a Pandora kind of experience to emerge. And I think who knows, we may be seeing that start right now. I'm hoping that happens. I mean, you just look at like a app like Swell. I think it's the Agogo app that you talk about is also a good experience as well. Mm-hmm. But I think we may be seeing the very beginnings of this happen right now, or where some very smart people are getting involved in this space and trying to solve these issues like we talked about, being cross-platform, being easy to use, being in the car, being, even Stitcher is another one, that are really trying to plow this territory to carve out a platform that can really be available on all of your devices. I mean, if you think about what we all do, I mean, I've kind of gone cross-platform myself. I have an iOS device, I have an Android, I have Windows. I want to have a platform that will work on all those devices, and I don't know that we have that yet.
In July of 2005, right from the very beginning, and I'm not begrudging what Apple has done to help the podcasting space, but in that same breath, they hurt us as much as they helped us. And that may even continue to be true today. But at the same time, a lot of these third-party apps, Swell and some of the other folks, they are making some of the same mistakes as some of the other folks have made in the past. While they're listening, they're really not listening to the community. And so to me, that's the troubling aspect. Everyone has a business objective, and you have to understand that at the same time. But yeah, I don't know. There is room, but boy, I tell you again, like Google's the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to search. Apple is the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to podcast consumption.
That's why, Todd. That's why I pick on Apple in this regard, because I mean, here's a company built on evaluating new spaces and saying, how can we make this space more consumer friendly and make a business out of it at the same time. They are the perfect company. I mean, just the fact that podcasting is wrapped around their brand. Yet you're quite right. In my view, they are sustaining the ghetto called podcasts through the separation of podcasts into their own app from iTunes and iTunes Radio, from that whole experience. And I think the problem that they're having is, on the one hand, they've got this archive called podcast, this archive called iTunes, and this other thing that's not archive called iTunes Radio that they're trying to figure out. And I think iTunes Radio has the potential to be its own standalone thing that includes music and non-music content. That, to me, is the obvious opportunity going forward, for iTunes Radio to be kind of connected to iTunes but not of iTunes, and for podcasts to be as related to iTunes as it is to the rest of the Apple platform.
From a pure data point, the iTunes podcast app was the large portion of the growth in 2012-13 timeframe. That was, from a consumption, purely a consumption number standpoint, was very, very positive. So that, again, I don't want to, bust on Apple from that aspect, but yeah, we are kind of like in our own little corner.
Well, I'll bust on them, Todd, because here's the research that I've done, and this echoes other research, shows that still, even now today, about 12% of America says they listen to podcasts.
Right.
I mean, Apple could turn that 12 into 20 if it wanted. And so far, it shows no sign of doing so.
And I think it's largely because you're right, they've stigmatized it, and it needs to go. Yeah, we need to be on an equal playing field. We have never been.
Though as you look at the kind of more management side of the iTunes Radio and podcasting area, from a content perspective and kind of a platform management perspective at the company, it's the same guy that's been assigned to run podcasting and the iTunes Radio. So, I mean, as you look at an organizational focus at Apple, it is combined currently today. It's just that it's put out as kind of visibly two separate products.
Right, and yet when I'm a listener and I'm tuning in the radio, I'm one switch away from one or the other. I don't have to change apps. It's not a dramatic departure. It's part of the same medium. These are arbitrary distinctions nurtured by a company whose agenda should be to eliminate them.
There's a comment in the chat room. K-Bird says, in video podcast, YouTube is the app that is on every platform. And we understand, obviously, YouTube is king on video, but there's not very many podcasters that are very successful on YouTube.
But Todd, I think that the commenter there has a good point. I think what we've seen has been successful at YouTube and what they've done as a cross-platform. Netflix is another example of it, right?
Yep.
Of what this medium needs to evolve to really grow and be ubiquitous and really start to gather momentum and build listener audience. Because I think that's one of the biggest things that, as an industry, if we want to call ourselves that, we need to focus on is how do we get more people listening to this content than we have today. I mean, just in a broad sense, not any specific program, but just across the board. How do we do that?
Yeah, I think that it's going to take some entity that's going to have enough money to be able to support a Netflix app on every platform. But you know how expensive that is?
Well, I would say a little bit different. I say if you want more people to listen to this content, we got to keep in mind, first of all, that people don't care what we think.
Right.
People care only what they think. So people are going to do what they want based on the problems that they have or don't have. So if I've got an appetite for something and there it is staring me in the face. I'm going to consume it. That's how Howard Stern happened.
Right.
Not because someone said, I want everyone to listen to Howard Stern. How am I going to do that? No, they put him on the radio for free, and the audience gravitated to it because the content was that compelling. So I would say step number one is get this stuff on the radio. And here I'm speaking to the broadcasters, not to you guys. And step number two is, eliminate the artificial barriers between these flavors of audio content. Even if I'm at Apple, Netflix doesn't have one app for documentaries and another for comedy.
True.
Even their new ability to filter on kids is within the same umbrella as the rest of Netflix.
So, Mark, it's really, really fascinating, your approach to that, because if you really back up and you think about it, you're basically flipping the paradigm on its head, because how people have typically thought of this is radio first and podcasting. Really what you're talking about now is that the on-demand podcasting side is the primary and radio is the sampling tool. Would that be accurate?
Well, radio is a sampling tool. Well, look at it this way. If you're in the music industry, radio is the sampling tool.
Right.
Yeah,
right?
so that...
Radio is the ultimate
paradigm
sampling tool.
that we're talking about, that we've completely switched, right, from what has been
Radio is the
in the
sampling
history.
tool. That's right. And this, by the way, is a big problem. In the research that I've done, one of the problems of podcast, period, is that people say, well, I don't listen to them more because they're too long.
Oh.
Well, what are they really saying there?
It's not compelling.
They're saying that it has a 60-minute running time. I'm not going to even attempt to listen to it. It starts off and wanders. Well, I've given it 30 seconds. The average person gives a video, 2 minutes?
Right.
I'm going to give a podcast more than that? You've got to be kidding me. So, the sampling problem is profound. And discovery and sampling are knit together, right? So that's why I say if we've got some great podcasts, some entertainment podcasts that can help attention for those podcasts, put them on the radio. Now, that's easy for us to say. You guys have to go and buy that time. You shouldn't have to buy that time. There should be a broadcaster out there that says, I've got 800 radio stations. My name's Clear Channel. All night long, I'm playing music. Well, let me see what else I can do with this time that'll attract an audience to me. And oh, by the way, maybe I should try and own a piece of Adam Carolla's show. Maybe I should try and own a piece of Aisha Tyler's show. Maybe that's the exchange. Maybe I own a piece of the show. I popularize it all night. Aisha's able to monetize it. I'm able to monetize it that way too. Everybody's better off. Aisha's a bigger star. I get her on my air. I introduce more people to my station, and I make more money.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, it's not a bad approach, Mark.
Because what and if you look at talk on AM, because that's where most of it is, you've got Rush, Hannity, Laura Ingraham. You got these 10, 12 national guys there, and it's mostly conservatives. But that's the extent. At least here in Hawaii, that's the extent of talk radio in Hawaii. You've got the Mark Ramsey, but they're all these talking head political types. And it gets sometimes it gets kind of old.
Well, it's not only does it get old, but it turns out it is old. It is old in terms of its targeting. It is old in terms of its audience delivery. A lot of that stuff is moving to FM because all of AM is generally moving to FM. But I've long argued that people are thinking about talk radio in too narrow terms. Yeah. They're thinking about it as political talk radio. Yeah. You know what? I've said to folks at Clear Channel before, you own Ryan Seacrest, you own Elvis Duran. Why don't you take all the shows that you own that are aimed towards women, 25 to 54-year-old women, entertainment shows that may have some music in them, instead of thinking this is purely talk versus music. Take your best morning shows, string them together on a handful of stations, string them together on one station. You own 800. Just one station, string them all together and see what happens. What you do in that process is you create a brand new format. It's a format of stars. You have doubled down on stars. And if you have stars in your portfolio, why are you spreading them around all these stations that are music 90% of the time? Why not put them on some stations and say, this is the star station? This is really what a star station is. It's a station full of stars. And they could do that. They have that capability. They've just never done it.
Yeah, and I do a lot of sampling of podcast, and I try to load 100 new shows every 2 weeks. And I try to get through them. And what I do is I give the shows tops 15 minutes but I give them a good 15 minutes to catch my attention. And it's often they're in my car. And if it's something I like, I'll stick through for a whole program. And I have crib notes on hundreds of shows, basically, that I've reviewed over the years. It's just internally tracking. And you're right, though, from a discovery standpoint, it's tough to get through the crap to find the gems.
Let me tell you something, Todd. If you had never heard of Howard Stern, let's say, and you were to give him 15 minutes,
it's not enough.
You'd never listen again.
Right.
You'd never listen again. This is why the difference between podcasting and broadcasting in this sense is broadcasters need to place bets. They need to place bets on content that they think will hit, just the way TV guys do.
Yep.
They need to place a bet. You watch 15 minutes of a TV show, you're not necessarily hooked.
That's right.
They need to place a bet. They need to live with it. They need to believe in it. They need to invest in it. They need to choose wisely, but they need to choose, and they need to take some chances, and they need to take some chances with quality content. And wouldn't it be great if we had this farm team where people are creating this content for free and nurturing audiences for free and nurturing audiences without any risk on our part? I wish we had a farm team like that in the world of radio. I wish podcasts existed.
Well, Mark, with that transition is gonna require that the broadcast side make significant changes to their formats, because I don't believe that this concept of a 3-hour daily program is going to be a viable option for a massively successful podcast or online show, because the consumption pattern is different, right? It's not a tune in, tune out scenario like it is on broadcast, and that's the big reason why they do 2 and 3 hour blocks on the radio side, and that's why these guys burn out, or it's not good content because there's just so much of it. What's your comment on that? Are these stations going to change?
You are absolutely right about that. And in fact, people have this misconception. The thing I get frustrated about is when radio stations put 3-hour-long podcasts, they have a show that's 3 hours long, they put a 3-hour-long podcast on their website. Who says I want a 3-hour-long podcast just because it lives on the radio for 3 hours? The fact is, when I'm listening to the radio, I listen in a 20-minute increment.
Yep.
So I don't hear a 3-hour show. I hear 20 minutes of a 3-hour show.
If you live in Hawaii,
I hear 20 minutes.
If you live in Hawaii, you listen to 90 minutes.
Yeah, because you're waiting in the big traffic jams, right?
Yeah.
So, but you're right. The dynamic for radio is that you need to have more consistency. You can't, the mistake that San Francisco station that you referred to made was, we're going to do one podcast after the other. It's going to be fabulous. And every 30 minutes, you're not going to have any idea what the heck you're listening to. No. But there are prime times, and then there are non-prime times. To do something at 10 o'clock at night, for example, when some stations in America took a little risk on a show called Loveline once upon a time, to do something at 10 o'clock at night that breaks format, which is what you're talking about, that's entirely reasonable. And if I'm breaking format at 10, and again, if you're, Kevin Smith or Aisha Tyler, you have years of content in an archive. So it's just the fact that you're creating only one new show a week isn't the problem anymore. Because I can run your shows as an archive over and over again. The way I do if I'm running, repeat episodes of Seinfeld.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we are way long, but Rob, we need to wrap here. But
okay.
Any final comments for our guest today?
Well, Mark, I appreciate you coming on. This has been a fabulous conversation, and I think I think we've touched on some really important points in the evolution of this convergence that I think needs to happen. So I just appreciate you coming on and sharing, and I know I'm excited to join you on stage at the HiVio event. I don't know, it'd be great for you to share a little bit more about that event and how people can participate.
I'll just say one word about it to be real quick. There you are. One word about it to be real quick. HiVio is an unconference that I'm hosting in San Diego on June 4th. at HiVio.com. I'm presenting it as kind of the Audio Future Festival. There are a bunch of people on stage with me, including you and some other folks that I'm not going to mention just yet, but soon, along with some special surprises. It's going to be great. It streams live, so you'll be able to see it for free. So check in at HiVio.com, just opt in, and you'll be in the loop for any information and communications about the show coming up on June 4th.
And, of course, we want to encourage everyone to get over to Mark's website at markramseymedia.com. And obviously there's a place there you can get on his email list as well, and all the contact information is at the top of the page. And I see that you do a blog as well, so that's cool. You can get information about what's going on with you over there. It's pretty fascinating for me. From a guy that did not have any roots in the media space before I started podcasting, it's been an interesting ride over the past, 10 years now almost. And so it's always good to, to hear basically get the opinion from the guys that have been in the space, in the radio space for a long time, and look at the parallels and where we're going. I'm still very pumped about the new media / podcasting space. I thought we were way behind the curve 6 years ago, and little did I know that we'd be fighting some of the same battles today as we were in the beginning. But I think the space is going to continue to evolve. Who knows where it's going to go in the end, but I think if the advertisers and stuff continue to recognize the content for what it is, we're going to start seeing the space liven up a little bit financially from a, invest, because that's what's really going to drive the space is the dollars. And maybe the radio market starting to graduate some of these folks into the big leagues. I don't know. We'll see. Rob,
yeah.
We're going to be off next week, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to Chicago for our annual retreat. And why we have it in Chicago is because Chicago in the winter is cold, and we basically aren't distracted. So we have a working 3 or 4 days in Chicago with the team from Raw Voice, and I'll be in D.C. The early part of the week, so that's going to be fun, always going to D.C. Just hope it doesn't get too cold. Pineapples don't transplant real well when it's 30 below. So
Todd, I do have a a guest that's gonna be on the show that following week.
Okay.
Clayton Morris, who's an anchor on Fox News,
okay,
and is a podcaster, is going to come on and join us.
Oh, that's going to be great. So we get the perspective from a broadcast guy this time.
Yep.
Yeah,
exactly.
Very, very cool. All right, Mark, thank you so much for coming on. Rob, thanks for your time. And everyone that's been watching, thanks for watching. If you were live, great. If not, obviously you're going to catch it DVR style, newmediashow.com, and the site's going to be changing soon. So, Rob, that we're a couple weeks away, I think, from the
That's exciting,
some site
Todd.
changes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're writing some code because I've got a weird setup and we got to do the conversion. But everyone, thanks for being here. We'll see you next time. Take care. Mark, again, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks,
guys.
Mark. Okay.
Thank you.
Everyone, aloha.
Bye.
Okay, the stream is still up. Let me shut the stream off. Lovely. You know what, YouTube, when you are streaming live on YouTube, the app has a tendency to log you out if you go more than about 30 minutes without touching anything. And they just, I don't know why they do that, but so those of you on YouTube, you're still watching us. Okay, here we go. All right.